Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. Both the G7 and NATO summits are taking place this week. It could mean intense negotiations and coordinations among the US and the Europeans, mainly on crucial strategic issues. For example, the group of 7 leaders, the richest countries in the world, are discussing the $600 billion in private and public funds for needed infrastructure in developing countries. Analysts suggest it is put forward by the U.S. to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, proposed by China years ago. Well, the launch and the implementation of the $600 billion are also to be an issue in the future. On that and the G7 summit, I invited this panel. In Singapore, I'm joined by James Ray, Professor of Politics from California State University. Good to see you, James. And also in New Delhi, I'm joined by Sitrapu Uday Bhaskar, who is the Director of the Society for Policy Studies. Thank you so much for both of you joining us. Let me ask you about your latest response to the effectiveness of G7 communications. Professor Ray.
Well, obviously, the crisis in Russia-Ukraine has forged a stronger bond among the European partners with the United States. I think the precursor to that, of course, was the unwillingness to push Russia too far among countries like Germany in terms of enlargement. The equation has changed, and so I think there's a greater alignment between Western Europe and the United States. It remains to be seen how durable that alignment will be, but I think that is stimulating cooperation in other areas that we might talk about later, economically and so forth.
And also, Mr. Bhaskar, India, of course, is not part of the G7, but many of the topics that are being discussed there closely watched by India. Tell me more about your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I would say that the G7 as a group has an existential relevance, largely because it represents the most affluent and the richest countries in the world. So to that extent, I think they have a certain weight in economic and financial and trade-related matters. But at the moment, I think, as Professor James has just pointed out, the challenge for the G7 and back-to-back the US-led NATO is how to deal with the war in Ukraine and the challenge posed by Russia, which I would say is the immediate challenge. But clearly the long-term anxiety for the G7 and the NATO is the China-Russia partnership and the way in which that has been interpreted by both Beijing and Moscow. And India is looking at this very carefully because many of India's core national interests are being impacted both by the war in Ukraine and the decisions that may be taken by the G7 and the NATO.
The leaders were symbolically showing their muscles with their white shirts, so-called to the Russian president. However, tell me more about what do you think at this stage with mixed realities they have to deal with? They have a different history and different ways of interacting with Russia previous to G7. Professor Ray, this discussion about Russia actually similarly in topic, yet very different in content.
Well, I think you're exactly right, Tianwei, that in the strategic realm, the US and the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, now Russia, have long been at loggerheads, and the US prioritizes the military conflict or military relations and strategic great power relations much more so than do the European countries. There's a different orientation, a different culture strategically between the US and Western Europe that could be fractured. And then economically, as we know, Western Europe's more dependent on energy and gas, oil, gas coming from Russia through Ukraine to Western Europe. And so these sanctions and the ongoing crisis are more of an energy threat to Western Europe than they are to the United States. And so I think that over time, if the conflict is not resolved soon, we'll probably see a rupture between those countries that are not aligned with America's greater geopolitical ambitions and have greater immediate energy concerns.
Mr. Bhaskar, of course, to India, Russia is a very different story compared to, let's just say, the story of Russia-Ukraine conflict to the United States. Now, from your perspective, how are you observing the nature of this discussion at the G7?
My assessment is that while the G7 as a group had focused on the war in Ukraine, when the scope of the meeting was extended and enlarged, and they invited the leaders of countries like Indonesia, India, and the other three countries, you saw that the focus shifted because even the US President, Mr. Joe Biden, in his remarks noted that there are differences of perspective. It is not such a major issue as far as the rest of the world is concerned, though we agree that there are some principles involved and also that there is a huge impact not only on the world energy market, but the world food market, the fertilizer market. And I think these are the kind of issues which the G7 plus was trying to address, but I would say ineffectively. Because if you look at the joint statement, I think that what the G7 said and what the G7 plus other leaders said, it was a bit effete in my view. It said the same thing about energy and all the other issues that we have heard many times. So as an analyst, I'm slightly disappointed that most of the oxygen was taken away by Ukraine.
The other issue, of course, very crucial, is the 600 billion US dollar infrastructure supporting program that the US put forward by the Biden administration. This is very complicated in terms of whether the plan will be implemented. China proposed years ago the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and worked with countries on that. Also, there are South-South cooperations beyond the BRI projects. Now, China also work on the Global Development Initiative, GDI. So how do you see, this interesting strategic suggestion put forward by the U.S. side on infrastructure-related issues? And how much is that about geopolitics? How much is that about providing answers to some of the crucial questions we're facing today? Professor Ray.
Well, I think you framed it very well. There's the diplomatic posture, and then there's the likelihood of implementation. But in terms of the plan put forward, I would have to say, for the United States, it reflects a bipartisan consensus that's developed and inside the Beltway between both parties and think tanks that China is directly a competitor, and there's really no voices for engagement with China in the United States any longer. And so it's reflective of that orientation. And then I would look at actions and words. And even before the Belt and Road Initiative, the US sponsored the Trans-Pacific Partnership and worked diligently for a decade to get it through the American Congress and to get other countries on board. And on day one, President Trump tore it up. And meanwhile, the Belt and Road Initiative has invested hundreds of billions of dollars building ports, developing high-speed rail across South Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's gone on without kind of the bluster. And then here we have a year ago, the G7 announcing the Build Back Better World initiative, and then the failure of America to implement its own domestic infrastructure plan. They've had to rebrand it now again. And so I don't have much confidence that it will be implemented on any scale that serves infrastructure development needs in developing countries. But I do think it, as you said, puts on notice that there is an alignment that European countries are willing to align in this initiative of the United States. Even though Europe is part of the Belt and Road as well, I don't think, like with Russia, the European countries will go along in the same ambitions that the US has, which is really to stymie China's growth.
Putting bilateral issues aside, China and India, how do you interpret about the Indo-Pacific policy, about this time the 600 billion US dollar infrastructure bill? How much opportunity can a country like India catch?
Personally, I believe that for every country and every leader, human security of the citizen is of paramount importance. Against that backdrop, I think South-South cooperation is very, very urgent and necessary at this point, particularly because of the convulsions that we have seen over the last 2 years, related both to the COVID pandemic and what that has done to human security, especially among the least developed countries and their own internal demographies, as also the war in Ukraine. And I believe personally that China and India can bring a lot to the table, particularly by way not only of the investment and the support that they provide in their own way. China does more than India because China has deeper pockets, but also the kind of experience that they have had.
Wrapping up G7, leading up to NATO, how do you see the messages are likely to be, Professor Ray?
Well, we know with Sweden and Finland's application for membership with NATO, we know the idea of Ukraine joining the EU, things are in flux. And, it's quite surprising after the reluctance to antagonize Russia in these areas that the invasion or the exercise of moving forces into Ukraine has stimulated these changes. And I don't know where they may end up. And it could be the worst case for Russia that Ukraine is going to be moving closer to participation and membership in NATO. So I think we don't know, but it's going to be dynamic, and we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, Mr. Bhaskar.
If NATO expansion takes place, my fear is that there would be a reaction from Moscow. Yeah. But the silver lining, if I could put it that way, is that after the G7, after the NATO summit, global leaders are preparing for the G20 summit in November in Indonesia. And the only silver lining is that at least global leaders are still talking to each other.
Thank you so much for both of you, Professor James Ray and Mr. Uday Bhaskar. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.